The cockpit of the F-4U Corsair is a symphony of violence. At 12,000 feet over the emerald waters of the Solomon Islands, Lieutenant Commander Edward "Ed" Jackson is no longer flying a plane. He is fighting a 5-ton beast of corrugated aluminum and a 2,000 horsepower engine. The air is thick with the scent of hydraulic fluid and the metallic tang of fear. Behind him, a V of 4 Mitsubishi A6M0s has just crested the horizon. They have the altitude. They have the sun. And in 10 seconds, they will have his life. His wingman is screaming over the radio. A frantic burst of static. "Dive, Ed. Get out of there." But Jackson doesn't dive. He does the one thing his flight instructor at Pensacola told him would lead to certain death. He pulls the stick back, kicks the rudder, and reaches for the landing gear lever in the middle of a dogfight. He is about to turn his fighter into a brick in the sky. What happened next would baffle the Japanese pilots and rewrite the rules of aerial engagement forever. If you want more true stories of impossible moments from World War II, subscribe to the channel. The year was 1943, and the Pacific was a graveyard for pilots who followed the book. The Japanese Zero was a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering, light, nimble, and capable of turning on a dime. The American philosophy was different. Build them heavy, build them fast, and never, ever try to outmaneuver a Zero at low speed. This was the gospel according to the Navy. But Ed Jackson, a former mechanical engineer from Detroit, didn't see a plane as a weapon. He saw it as a problem of physics. While his fellow pilots were practicing high-speed passes, Jackson was in the hangars, measuring the drag coefficients of the Corsair's massive gull wings. He was obsessed with the idea of force drag. He believed that if you could change the shape of the plane mid-flight, you could break the enemy's logic. His instructors called it suicide. They mocked his habit of studying stall recovery at low altitudes. They told him that in a real fight, the whistling death, as the Japanese called the Corsair, needed speed to survive. To slow down was to die. The mission that changed everything started as a routine escort for a group of slow-moving, dauntless dive bombers. The tropical heat was a physical weight pressing against the canopy, making the air inside the cockpit feel like a wet blanket. Jackson's squadron, the Blue Devils, were positioned high and wide, but the Japanese were waiting. Out of a massive bank of cumulus clouds, the Zeros struck. It wasn't a dogfight, it was an execution. The Zeros used their superior agility to get inside the Corsair's wide-turning radius. Within minutes, 2 American planes were trailing smoke, spiraling toward the sea. Jackson saw the trap closing. He saw his squadron leader being chased by 2 veteran Japanese pilots who were playing with him, waiting for the heavy Corsair to bleed enough speed to become a stationary target. Jackson knew that if he followed standard doctrine, diving to gain speed, he would leave his commander defenseless. He had to do something that defied the manual. He leveled his wings, took a deep breath that tasted of rubber and oxygen, and jammed the gear lever down. In the high-speed world of a dogfight, extending the landing gear is an act of insanity. It creates massive, uneven drag. It shakes the airframe so violently that rivets can pop like champagne corks. But to Jackson, it was a break. A giant, invisible hand reached out and grabbed the Corsair. The Japanese pilots behind him were shocked. One moment, the American fighter was accelerating away. The next, it was looming large in their windscreens. They had no time to adjust. Their closing speed was so high that they overshot Jackson in a blur of green and white. They had expected a chase. They found a wall. As they zoomed past, Jackson retracted the gear, the hydraulic pumps whining in protest. The Corsair surged forward, the massive 13-foot propeller biting into the air. He was now behind them. He squeezed the trigger. The 6.50 caliber machine guns tore the first Zeros, wing clean off. The second pilot tried to roll away, but Jackson, using the momentary lift from his dirty configuration, followed him into a tight, impossible turn. The sky erupted in a bloom of orange fire. But the battle was far from over. Jackson's maneuver had saved his commander, but had also drawn the attention of the entire Japanese formation. He was now the primary target. The professor was about to be put to the ultimate test. He was alone, his altitude was low, and his engine was screaming at the limit of its endurance. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving that the whistling death could do more than just run. It could hunt. The vibration in the stick was a constant, rhythmic thudding. Jackson's eyes were darting from his rearview mirror to his fuel gauges. He was low on juice, and his oil temperature was climbing into the red. But he could see the remaining Zeros regrouping. They weren't arrogant anymore. They were angry. They had seen their comrades fall to a maneuver they didn't understand. They came at him from 3 different angles, a coordinated strike designed to overwhelm any pilot's senses. Jackson felt the heat of the tracers passing his cockpit. He could hear the thwack of lead hitting the armored plate behind his head. The cockpit was filling with the smell of scorched electrical wiring. He was pinned. "Come on, you big iron bird," Jackson whispered, his knuckles white against the control column. He didn't break for the horizon. He didn't try to outrun them. He waited until the last possible second, until he could see the goggles of the lead Japanese pilot. Then he did the unthinkable again. He didn't just drop the gear. He dropped the flaps to the full landing position while banked at 60 degrees. It was a maneuver that should have caused a catastrophic stall. It should have sent him spinning into the Pacific. Instead, the Corsair hopped in the air, a sudden, violent jump that cleared the path of the incoming cannon fire. The Japanese pilots were flying by instinct, and their instinct told them that a plane that slows down that fast is crashing. They broke their formation, thinking Jackson was going down. It was the opening he needed. He retracted the flaps, kicked the rudder, and brought the nose around with a grace that the Corsair wasn't supposed to possess. 1 burst. 2. The Zeros fell away, smoking ruins in the tropical air. When the Blue Devils finally landed back on the carrier, the silence on the deck was profound. The ground crews looked at Jackson's Corsair. The landing gear doors were warped. The wings were rippled from the G-forces. The mechanics had never seen a plane so structurally stressed, yet still flying. Jackson climbed out, his legs shaking, his face smeared with grease and soot. His instructor, who happened to be on the deck as a liaison officer, walked up to him. He looked at the buckled metal, then at the 4 kill marks Jackson's wingman had already begun to confirm over the radio. "That wasn't flying, Jackson," the instructor said, his voice a mix of anger and awe. "That was a controlled crash." "No, sir," Jackson replied, wiping his brow. "That was engineering." The silence in the debriefing room was more suffocating than the humidity of the Solomon Islands. As the senior officer stared at the professor, Ed Jackson didn't reach for a medal or a drink. He reached for a piece of chalk. The whiteboard was quickly covered in a frantic web of aerodynamic vectors and drag coefficients. He wasn't speaking the language of a war hero. He was speaking the cold, hard dialect of a structural engineer. He explained that at 300 knots, the F-4U Corsair's landing gear didn't just act as a wheel. It acted as a massive, asymmetric air brake that disrupted the airflow over the trailing edge of the wing. "The Zero pilot is a master of the turn," Jackson said, his voice echoing in the cramped metal room. "He expects us to play the game of energy. He expects us to dive to get away, or to pull into a wide, sweeping arc. But when I drop the gear, I'm not just slowing down. I'm shifting the center of pressure. I'm forcing my Corsair to rotate around a point in space that the Japanese flight manuals say doesn't exist. I'm essentially tripping the airplane, so it falls into a turn faster than the Zero can follow." The room remained skeptical. His flight instructor, a man who had seen 100 pilots burn in the Pacific, slammed a hand on the table. "It's a stunt, Jackson. You got lucky. If that gear mechanism had jammed, or if the asymmetric drag had snapped a spar, you'd be at the bottom of the ocean. You're teaching these boys that it's okay to break the plane to save their skins. That's not doctrine. That's madness." But the results were undeniable. For Zeros were at the bottom of the sea, and Jackson's Corsair, though battered and buckled, was sitting on the deck, ready to fly again. The Navy brass faced a dilemma. Do they court-martial the man for reckless flying, or do they listen to the professor? They chose a middle path. They ordered a series of secret trials of fire over the next week. Jackson was to fly against the squadron's top booms and zoomers, pilots who followed the book to the letter, to see if his maneuver was a repeatable tactic or a one-time miracle. The trials were grueling. Day after day, Jackson took to the sky. He was the rabbit. and the Navy's best hunters were the Hounds. They dived on him from 20,000 feet, their engines screaming as they lined up their sights. Every time, Jackson waited for the precise moment, the moment when the attacker was committed to his path. He would slam the gear lever down. The Corsair would shudder violently, the airframe groaning under the sheer force of the forced drag. The Hounds would overshoot, their high-speed momentum carrying them right into Jackson's waiting sights. The atmosphere in the ready room began to shift. The mockery was replaced by a desperate, hungry curiosity. Pilots who had once laughed at Jackson's bookishness were now found in the hangars at midnight, staring at the landing gear struts, trying to understand how a piece of hydraulic machinery could be used as a weapon of war. Jackson became a shadow instructor. He taught them about transient lift, the brief window where the plane is neither flying nor stalling, but is suspended in a state of controlled chaos. However, a new threat was looming on the horizon. Intelligence reports indicated that a new elite Japanese unit, led by veterans from the carrier battles of 1942, was moving into the sector. These pilots weren't rookies. They had seen every American trick, and they were experts at managing their own energy. They wouldn't overshoot as easily as the green pilots Jackson had faced before. The professor's theory was about to meet its most lethal challenge. The stakes were raised when Jackson's commander, a man who had become a believer in the gear drop, was tasked with a high-stakes intercept mission over a vital Allied convoy. The Blue Devils were outnumbered 3-1. Jackson knew that the standard tactics would result in a 50% loss rate. He spent the night before the mission in the cockpit of his Corsair, his flashlight illuminating the technical manuals one last time. He wasn't looking for courage. He was looking for the limit, the exact speed where the gear doors would shear off, and the exact speed where he could still survive the turn. As the sun began to peak over the Pacific, the roar of 24 Pratt and Whitney engines filled the air. This wasn't just another mission. This was the final exam for the professor's madness. The Blue Devils climbed into the blue, their gear tucked away, their hearts pounding. Somewhere in the clouds ahead, the elite Japanese veterans were waiting. They didn't know that the Americans were coming with a new kind of math. They didn't know that for the men of the Blue Devils, the landing gear wasn't for coming home. It was for winning. The first contact was made at 18,000 feet. The radar operator's voice crackled over the radio, tense and high-pitched. Bandits, 30+, high and fast. They're coming out of the sun. Jackson looked up, squinting through the glare. He saw the shimmering silver specks of the Elite Zeros. They weren't diving in a disorganized swarm. They were moving in a disciplined, lethal V formation, closing the gap with terrifying speed. Division, listen up. Jackson's voice was a calm anchor in the rising storm of static. We don't break. We don't dive. We wait for the signal. We're going to show them the professor's trap. Hold your speed until I call it. If you move too early, you're dead. If you move too late, you're dead. Watch your spacing. The Zeros dived. The air was suddenly filled with the thrum-thrum of 20mm cannon fire. Tracers zipped past Jackson's canopy, close enough to see the white-hot core of the phosphorus. His wingman, Miller, was breathing hard, his Corsair dancing nervously in the turbulence. The Japanese lead pilot, an ace with 15 kills to his name, lined up Jackson's tail. He smiled behind his goggles. The American was staying straight and level. It was an easy kill. He squeezed the trigger. Now, Jackson roared. Simultaneously, 8 Corsairs jammed their gear levers down. The sky was suddenly filled with the sound of protesting metal and the sudden, violent roar of air hitting the landing gear wells. It was as if the entire American squadron had hit an invisible wall. The Japanese ace, caught in the middle of a high-speed firing run, had less than half a second to react. His Zero soared over Jackson's cockpit, so close that Jackson could see the oil stains on the enemy's belly. The professor's trap had been sprung, but the Japanese veterans were quick. They didn't just sail away. They pulled into vertical climbs, trying to use their superior power-to-weight ratio to reset the fight. Jackson knew this was the critical moment. If the Americans couldn't capitalize on the overshoot in the next 5 seconds, the Zeros would come back down on their heads while they were still slow and vulnerable. Retract. Power to WEP. Jackson commanded. The hydraulic pumps screamed as the gear doors slammed shut. The Corsairs surged forward, their engines belching blue flame as they engaged the water injection systems. Jackson pulled his stick back, feeling the G-force trying to push his heart into his stomach. He wasn't chasing the Zero. He was intercepting its path. He lined up the shot, his thumb hovering over the red button on the stick. The world slowed down. The smell of high-octane fuel and his own sweat filled his mask. He saw the Zero's tail surfaces in his sights. The sky was a kaleidoscope of spinning horizons and tracers. Jackson's thumb depressed the firing button, and the 6.50 caliber machine guns in his wings roared. The heavy slugs tore into the Japanese Ace's engine cowling, shredding the delicate valve gear of the Nakajima Sakai engine. The Zero didn't explode immediately. Instead, it blossomed into a terrifying trail of white smoke and orange flame, its pilots struggling to maintain control as the aircraft began a slow, terminal roll into the sea. But the professor had no time to watch his handiwork. The Japanese veterans had adapted, seeing their leader fall to the gear drop trap. The remaining Zeros didn't zoom away. They split into pairs, utilizing a high-low sandwich maneuver. One Zero would stay high to bait the Corsair into a climb, while the second would cut across the circle at low altitude to catch the heavy American fighter as it bled speed. Jackson saw the trap forming around Miller. "Miller, don't climb. He's baiting you." Jackson's voice was a whip crack over the radio. "Stay level and prepare for stage 2. Miller was shaking. He could see the Zero above him, its wings glinting in the sun like a polished blade. He could feel the vibration of the second Zero's cannons hitting his tail surfaces. "Ed, I can't stay here. I'm getting chewed up." "Trust the math, Miller." Jackson roared. "Give me the flaps. 20 degrees now." This was the second half of Jackson's suicide manual. While the landing gear was a blunt instrument for a massive overshoot, the combat flaps were a surgical tool. By deploying them at 20 degrees during a high-speed bank, the Corsair didn't just slow down. It gained a momentary, massive burst of lift that allowed it to pivot on its wingtip. It was a maneuver that put immense stress on the wing spars, a move that the Navy instructors had specifically warned would cause structural failure. Miller slammed the flap lever down. The Corsair groaned, a sound of tortured metal that Miller could hear even over the roar of the engine. The plane didn't stall. Instead, it snapped around in a turn so tight it defied the Zero's ability to track. The Japanese pilot, who had been closing in for the sandwich kill, suddenly found himself staring at the side of Miller's fuselage. Before the enemy could adjust, Miller's nose swung across the Zero's flight path. He didn't even need to aim. He just poured lead into the passing blur. The Zero's wing folded like paper, and the aircraft vanished into the clouds below. The battle had turned. The elite Tanamizu Eagles, who had never lost a formation engagement, were being dismantled by a tactic they couldn't find in any textbook. They were fighting an enemy that could change its aerodynamic profile in a heartbeat. A fighter that was a high-speed interceptor 1 second and a low-speed brawler the next. As the last of the Zeros broke contact and dived for the safety of Rabaul, the Blue Devils regrouped. They were battered, their ammunition was nearly spent, and their planes were covered in the scars of a controlled crash. Jackson looked at his gauges. His fuel was dangerously low, and his hydraulic pressure was fluctuating, a sign that his frantic gear and flap cycling had pushed the system to its breaking point. The landing back on the USS Independence was the ultimate test of Jackson's engineering. His landing gear, warped by the high-speed deployment, wouldn't lock into place. He had to fly a low pass by the island, so the deck officers could inspect the struts with binoculars. The word came back. "One side is hanging loose, Ed. You're going to have to bring it in hard." Jackson didn't panic. He used the very flaps that had saved him in the air to cushion his descent, playing the wind like a violin. He touched down on one wheel, holding the damaged wing up until the last possible second before the Corsair ground to a halt in a shower of sparks and shredded metal. He climbed out of the cockpit, his legs finally giving way, and sat on the wing of his broken bird. His instructor, the man who had called him a suicide risk, walked up to the wreck. He didn't yell. He didn't talk about court-martials. He reached out a hand and helped Jackson up. I'm going to need those diagrams, Ed, the instructor said quietly. All of them. From the beginning. The Jackson maneuver became the secret weapon of the Corsair squadrons for the remainder of the war. It was the birth of variable configuration combat, the idea that a pilot shouldn't just fly the plane, but should fundamentally alter it to meet the needs of the moment. Ed Jackson went back to Detroit after the war, but his mind never truly left the cockpit. He spent his career designing the next generation of aircraft, ensuring that the math of survival would be built into every wing and every bolt. He had proven that in the ultimate test of man and machine, the winner isn't always the one with the fastest engine. It's the one who is brave enough to redefine the rules when the world says the book is closed. The professor had turned madness into a science, and in doing so, he had ensured that his squadron didn't just survive history. They made it. If you enjoy real World War II stories, where skill and courage change history, subscribe for more. What's the one rule in your life you'd be willing to break to survive? Would you like me to create a script for another legendary aviation story, perhaps focusing on the unflyable B-26 Marauder or the experimental jet fighters of 1945?